I still remember the way her nose wrinkled, the little curl of disgust tugging at her lips as she held the small velvet box in her hand, the very same one I had saved up for weeks to buy. And when she finally opened it, the silver necklace glimmered faintly under the kitchen light, catching the reflection of her eyes for a brief second before she scoffed and said, "This looks cheap." I stood there, my fingers still trembling from the anticipation of giving her something thoughtful, my chest tight with the kind of hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd see the meaning behind it, but instead she twisted the chain between her fingers like it was a dollar store trinket and dropped it back into the box as if she couldn't be bothered to even try it on. I didn't say anything then. I just nodded, forced a smile, and told her it was fine. But deep inside, the words landed like a knife, not because of the necklace itself, but because it carried all those long shifts I had pulled at the auto shop, the overtime hours I'd taken, and the quiet sacrifices I made so she could have what she wanted without ever needing to think about how hard I worked. It wasn't even about the money. Hell, I could have bought her something flashier if I'd drained my savings. But the necklace was chosen because it reminded me of when we first met at a 4th of July barbecue in Denver, when she wore this thin chain with a tiny star pendant that she said was her lucky charm. And I wanted to give her something that matched that memory, something symbolic. But of course, sentiment didn't matter to her, not anymore. Maybe it was my fault for not seeing the red flags earlier. The way she'd roll her eyes whenever I talked about my day, or how she would light up only when the conversation turned to what she wanted, where she wanted to go, or what new purse she had been eyeing on Instagram. That night, she went to bed early, muttering something about being tired, and I sat in the living room staring at the little velvet box on the coffee table, feeling stupid, like I'd just been a walking ATM she no longer respected. But here's the thing. Silence is sometimes louder than words, and when I didn't argue back, when I didn't defend myself or try to convince her the necklace had value, I think it unnerved her. Over the next few days, I kept my distance. I went to work, came home, did my own thing. She noticed, of course. She tried to bait me with sarcastic remarks, little digs about how her friend's boyfriend had bought her a Tiffany bracelet or how some men knew how to treat their women. But I didn't bite. Instead, I watched, listened, and waited, because deep down I knew that people like her, people who measured worth in carats and price tags, always revealed themselves sooner or later. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A week later, she asked if I could lend her my credit card because she had an emergency. Something about her tone was rehearsed, like she had already prepared the story, but when I asked what kind of emergency, she flinched before saying it was just groceries. That didn't add up. Our fridge was stocked, and I'd already noticed new shopping bags tucked away in the back of her closet. So I said nothing, just handed her the card and let her walk away with that smug little smile on her face, thinking she had me wrapped around her finger. That night, while she was in the shower, I opened her purse and checked the receipts. Louis Vuitton, Saks Fifth Avenue, a bill totaling more than my rent. My pulse hammered, but I didn't storm into the bathroom or confront her because at that exact moment, I realized the necklace wasn't the insult. It was the warning sign. She mocked what was personal to me, something chosen with care, but what she valued was hollow, transactional. And if she thought I was too blind or too weak to see that, then she was in for a surprise. Because I had been quiet not out of weakness but calculation. I had grown up watching my father, a mechanic with calloused hands and a calm temper, dismantle engines piece by piece when something was broken. He never forced it. He studied, he understood, and then he fixed it so it would never fail again. That's exactly what I decided to do. With her, with us, with this sham of a relationship. I was going to take it apart piece by piece until she was left staring at the hollow shell of what she thought she controlled. And as I lay in bed that night listening to the sound of the shower turning off and her humming some carefree tune, I already began mapping it out. How to expose her greed, how to show her the weight of mocking someone's effort, and how to make sure that when she looked back on this week, she'd remember it as the moment her games ended. She thought she had won, but what she didn't know is that I had just stopped playing by her rules. And when that shift happens, when someone like me decides to fight back quietly, it's already too late for someone like her.
The next week became a test of patience, and I treated it the same way I treated a stubborn engine that refused to start. You don't force it, you wait for the right moment, the right spark. She thought nothing had changed, that I was still the same quiet, compliant guy who'd hand over his card and swallow the disrespect like it was my daily bread. But inside, I was sharpening every detail, every memory, every slip of her tongue into a blade I could use. The receipts had already given me a blueprint of who she really was, but I needed more. So I started paying attention, really paying attention, in ways I never had before. When she claimed she was meeting her cousin for lunch, I checked her location through the Find My iPhone app. She was actually at a rooftop bar downtown, sipping cocktails in a dress I had never seen before, one she must have bought with the money she drained from me. When she said she needed a mental health day from work, I happened to drive by her office and saw her car parked outside the mall instead. Piece by piece, I collected the evidence, like a mechanic laying out his tools in perfect order before tearing into the engine block. But the hardest part wasn't watching her lies pile up. It was pretending not to notice, pretending to still be that guy who nodded and let it all slide. At night, she would crawl into bed, smelling faintly of perfume I didn't recognize, mumbling half-hearted excuses about traffic or phone dying, and I'd pull her close, kiss her on the forehead, and whisper goodnight like I always had. She never saw the shift in my eyes because she wasn't looking for it. People like her never look back when they think they've already won. My father used to say, "The best way to fix a bad engine is not to patch it up, but to replace the whole damn thing." And I finally understood what he meant. This relationship wasn't just broken, it was corroded down to the bolts. But walking away wasn't enough. No, not after she mocked the necklace, not after she treated my effort like it was worthless, not after she paraded her greed like a trophy. I needed her to feel the weight of it, to choke on the same humiliation she made me swallow. So I began planning. First, I pulled my credit report, checked every account, and froze my cards. She didn't notice right away, not until she tried to use them later that week and called me at the shop, her voice dripping with fake sweetness as she asked if I'd forgotten to pay the bill. I told her calmly that I had moved some money around for an investment and things were just temporarily tight. She huffed but didn't push it, probably because she thought she'd find another way to squeeze me. That night, I stayed up late in the garage tinkering with my old Mustang, the one she always complained about taking up too much space. And as I tightened the bolts under the hood, I decided the Mustang would be my weapon. Not literally, but symbolically, because that car had been my dream since I was 16, and I had restored it piece by piece, never giving up even when people said it was scrap metal. It was proof that I could rebuild, that I could start over, that I could create something valuable with my own two hands. She had laughed at that car once, called it a rust bucket with a paint job, but I knew it was worth more than any shiny necklace she paraded on her Instagram stories. So I took pictures, polished it, and listed it for sale at a price higher than she thought it was worth. When the offers came flooding in, I made sure she overheard me turning him down. She couldn't understand why I wouldn't cash out, because to her, everything had a price. But for me, this was about something bigger. I wasn't just selling a car. I was selling the illusion she had of me, the illusion that I was desperate to hold on to her. The more she thought I was still hooked, the sharper the blade of revenge would cut when I finally swung it. Meanwhile, she kept making mistakes. One evening, she left her laptop open, and I saw her email thread with a friend, mocking me for being so easy to manipulate and bragging about how she planned to upgrade her collection once she convinced me to buy her a Cartier bracelet for her birthday. My hands clenched so hard my nails dug into my palms, but I forced myself to breathe, screenshot everything, and quietly close the laptop. Every insult, every betrayal, every careless word became fuel for what I was building. I wasn't just going to leave her. I was going to dismantle her carefully crafted image, piece by piece, until all she had left was the reflection of her own greed staring back at her. I started small, cutting off the luxuries she took for granted. I canceled the streaming services she binge-watched all day, returned the spa membership she never thanked me for, and let her think it was due to budgeting issues. Watching her squirm, watching her complain, watching her reveal just how shallow she was, it was all part of the engine teardown. But the masterpiece, the real revenge, was still forming in my head, and when it came together, it would be flawless. Because while she mocked the necklace as cheap, what she didn't know is that I had already bought something else in those quiet days. A new piece of jewelry, custom made, not for her, but for the ending she didn't see coming. And when the time came, that necklace was going to shine brighter than any diamond she had ever begged for, because it would carry not just silver or gold, but justice.
By the time October turned its first gray page, my plan had settled into a rhythm. Quiet, precise, and unforgiving. And I moved through the days like a surgeon in a dim-lit operating room, every action deliberate, every silence measured. She had started to notice the little things, the missing streaming accounts, the returned spa cards, my sudden insistence on separating joint finances into clearly defined buckets she couldn't access without my say-so. Her irritation showed in passive-aggressive texts and the way she'd snapped the sugar packet open with too much force at breakfast. But still she wore her practiced air of superiority in public, posting brunch photos with captions about treating myself, while tagging friends who offered the exact kind of validation she craved. I let her have it. Let her parade that hollow validation because I was collecting proof, and proof is the only thing that makes people accountable. The Mustang listing had done more than stir curiosity. It lit a match under her entitlement. She began to whisper about upgrading our life to her friends, as if I'd made some secret promise to bankroll the fantasy she lived in. That's when I decided to escalate, to turn her own vanity into a trap she couldn't crawl out of. I reached out to an old coworker from the shop, a guy named Marco who owed me a favor from years ago when I covered his truck repairs so he could make rent. Marco had a side job, detail work, staging, even running buyer meetups for high-end sales, and I asked him to play a part. I told Marco I wanted to stage a private showing for the Mustang, to bait a buyer who would make an outrageous offer, someone rich enough to make her mouth go dry when she heard the number. Marco grinned and said he liked the idea. He called it poetic. Over the next few days, Marco and I prepared everything. Photos taken at sunset to make the paint sing, a professional description that hinted at rarity and provenance, a clean title, everything polished to a high shine. I made sure the listing used language a certain type of person couldn't resist. Collector's mint, garage kept, original V8. Then I planted the seed with her friends. Not directly. I did it through a staged Instagram ad, targeted only to the circle that followed her posts. An artful snapshot of the Mustang with a caption about dreams for sale, and a callback to the 4th of July memories she loved talking about. The moment the ad hit her feed, she texted me, practically vibrating with excitement about who's listing it and why are you selling your dream. She accused me of being reckless, of not appreciating the opportunity to cash out and give her what she wanted. I played the reluctant romantic, told her I was considering offers for practical reasons, that maybe it was time to convert some assets into future stability. She rolled her eyes and said stability wasn't sexy. New designer shoes were. Her greed was now loud enough to be a weapon, and I was sharpening it. Meanwhile, I continued to document everything else. Her receipts, the private messages where she mocked me, the photos of her at boutiques I'd never been to. I created a folder on my laptop labeled Evidence, and every time she slipped up, I added another file with a name so mundane it would never draw suspicion. Utilities oct.pdf, groceries.sep.pdf. But the folder wasn't just for me, it was for the people who would matter when the curtain finally fell.
Because revenge without audience is just bitterness, and I wanted witnesses, friends, family, the small community we had cultivated, people who would see the truth and not the mask she wore on Instagram. The plan called for a performance, and every performance needs an audience. 2 weeks later, the bait worked. A buyer called, an older man with a deep voice and an employer with initials that suggested wealth. He came to see the car that Saturday with his driver and an appraiser. I staged the meeting so that she overheard it. I spoke on the phone in the living room, letting the numbers roll off my tongue so she could hear me say the offer was more than 3 times what she assumed the car was worth. Her reaction was instantaneous. She practically levitated with greed, asking if we could use the money to finally get that trip and whether I'd split it fairly. I acted flummoxed, like a man forced into an uncomfortable decision, and she took the bait, pressing me to sell sooner rather than later. But that was not the end game. That same night, I told her I was considering taking the buyer to a private auction the following weekend, an exclusive event where collectors and gallery owners mingled, and I invited her to come along as my +1. She smiled like a cat who knew where the cream was hiding. She loved these staged displays of wealth, and the idea of being seen was irresistible. I booked the tickets, arranged for a small, tasteful hotel nearby, and let her gloat as she packed outfits she thought would impress. The weekend arrived and we drove into the city, her chatter filling the car like sugar in coffee, while I listened in silence, watching the way she applied lipstick just so in the rearview mirror, practicing a smile that said she was already winning. At the auction, the air smelled of old money and polished wood. People moved with practiced indifference, and I felt the plan tighten like a noose around the small, fragile bubble she lived in. My buyer greeted me warmly and steered the conversation toward taste and legacy, mentioning names and houses I knew would impress her. I let him talk. I let her bask. But then when the moment was ripe and the auctioneer called the lot she wanted to drool over, a small collection of designer necklaces, I leaned over and in a voice she didn't expect, said, "You know, I found something at a pawn shop once, something that proved to me the difference between real value and show." She turned, curious the way a shark turns toward the surface, and that was all I needed. I pulled out my phone, opened the evidence folder, and with my hands steady for the first time in weeks, played the voice memo where she and her friend laughed about me being so easy. The sound cut through the polite murmurs like ice cracking on a pond. Heads turned. Her face drained of the careless color she always relied on. She tried to laugh it off, to say it was a joke, but the appraiser's eyebrow arched and my buyer's smile froze into something cold and measured. I watched the room contract around her, watched people catalog her in their heads, not as the glamorous woman she curated online, but as someone whose private cruelty had bled into her public persona. The humiliation was a surgical strike, precise, public, unavoidable. And when she bolted toward the exit, I didn't follow. I let her go, because the point was not to chase, but to expose. She stormed back into the hotel room that night, voice high and furious, demanding to know why I played her like that, why I dragged her into humiliation. I sat on the edge of the bed, exhausted and oddly serene, and told her the truth in the calmest voice I'd used since all this began. That I was done pretending silence was acceptance, that I had finally seen the cost of her contempt, and that I would no longer provide her with the currency she used to buy her identity. She screamed, accused me of being petty, of breaking the fantasy she'd built for herself. I watched her unravel, but I didn't gloat. Revenge, I'd learned, is not about joy. It's about correction. And as she collapsed into bitter tears, her mascara like black rivers down her cheeks, I realized the final scene was still ahead. The auction humiliation had cracked her armor, but the real ending would be when everyone she knew saw the truth and she had nothing to hide behind.
I closed my eyes and let the silence hold us both, knowing that when the last act came, it would be clean, sharp, and forever searing in her memory. Because some lessons, once learned, never fade.
When the dust finally settled, it didn't look like the cartoons or the movies where someone dances on the ashes of an ex's life. It looked quieter, bleaker, and more honest, like a mechanic sweeping the garage floor after a long, necessary job. The auction had pulled the thread that unraveled her carefully stitched facade, and once people saw the raw edge beneath the polish, the dominoes began to fall in ways I hadn't all at once expected, but had quietly prepared for. Her friends, the ones who'd liked and commented on every designer post, began to distance themselves in strained, awkward messages that pretended concern, but reeked of judgment. Her boss called to check in, and under the surface of professional concern, I could hear the same whisper of disappointment that had been spreading through the town, the kind of social currency that corrodes reputations faster than any public post could. Creditors started sending notices. The card companies that had once approved her purchases started calling for verification. She tried to pivot, to charm and salvage, using the smile that had gotten her free appetizers and favorable mentions for years, but now it rang hollow, the same way a name-brand perfume smells cheap once you know it's synthetic. I watched the unraveling with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief because the person I had loved, the real, kind person from that 4th of July, was gone under the weight of greed she'd let grow in her. Sorrow because people rarely change overnight, and because part of me still grieved the small version of her who'd once teased me about my rusty Mustang and then laughed with me at midnight about nothing in particular. But grief is different from tolerance. The former is a private ache, the latter is complicity. I realized I hadn't set out to humiliate her for cruelty's sake. I had set out to reclaim my dignity and to force a reckoning for myself and anyone else she might steamroll. The practical parts of the plan I had laid months ago began to finish themselves off like a clock returning to stillness. I had consolidated evidence in a file, not just for the satisfaction of exposure, but as an anchor for change. If she wanted to rebuild, she would have to face what she'd done. I offered to sit down with her and go over the debts, the receipts, the way our finances had been misused. She refused with a fury that made me more certain of my choice. Instead, she lashed out publicly, posting tear-streaked videos and cryptic captions that tried to sell her version of victimhood. Gaslighting, she wrote. Manipulation, she hinted, but the edits were thin and the timing suspicious. People saw through it. Sympathy doesn't stick where evidence is neat and presentable. Her attempts to rewrite the story only tightened the circle of witnesses who had seen the other side, my side, without romanticizing it. In the days that followed, some messengers arrived at my door, muted, nervous women from her circle, older cousins who remembered the girl before the Instagram life, her mother who came looking for answers. She had told stories about me, half-packaged confessions about an insensitive partner that had for a while window-slid perception in her favor. Now, face-to-face with the receipts and voice memos, a different narrative clicked into place. Her mother's eyes, once soft and indulgent, went hard as she flipped through the screenshots I'd organized, and when she left, there was no embrace, only the quiet click of the car door and the soft thud of a relationship closing. I didn't gloat. There was no triumphant speech, no victory lap. Instead, there was a meeting with calm adults, a rearrangement of realities, and in that unromantic aftermath, real work to be done. Practicalities. I separated the accounts, we signed a document that made clear who owed what, and I hired a small accountant to walk us through disentangling the financial mess. There was no courtroom drama. The law often moves at a pace that does not serve the swift needs of justice and personal economies, but there are ways to close doors that are just as effective. I froze joint accounts, removed her name from subscriptions, and reclaimed my credit. Actions that felt less like revenge and more like borders redrawn after a long, unhealthy cohabitation. People asked if I regretted the public exposure, if I felt I'd stooped to her level. The truth was that I'd never expected applause. I expected clarity, and clarity arrived with a cost. The hardest part was watching how fast people recalibrated their view of me. Some saw the exposure and called me cruel. Others saw it and called me brave.
Both responses were simple and small compared to the complexity of the feeling I carried. That night, after the last emails were sent and the last boxes of her designer things were removed from the apartment by a friend who refused to lift a finger for drama, I found the little velvet box again, under the couch, shoved into a corner where she had tossed it one night when she was furious. I picked it up, and this time I opened it, not to relive the sting of her words, but to reclaim the moment for myself. The chain inside, while not expensive by the world's standards, glittered with the memory of why I'd chosen it. Because I believed in small, meaningful things more than showy, hollow ones. I considered throwing it away, selling it, leaving it to whatever fate usually met symbols that had become tainted by history, but instead, I kept it. I put it on the workbench and set about a small ritual that felt like closure. I cleaned the chain, polished the tiny pendant until it caught the light like a promise, and then I took a file and engraved the underside with the date the relationship had begun, a private marker not for nostalgia, but for the truth that I had once loved and had once been loved in return, before that version of her dissolved. I didn't do it for her. I did it for me, to acknowledge that even painful relationships have chapters worth remembering without apology. The last scene wasn't cinematic. There was no dramatic reveal where she was publicly shamed into confession. It was quieter. A message from her at midnight, short and sharp. You win. Leave me alone. I read it and felt the weight in my chest that was equal parts relief and finality. I replied with 3 words that felt like both closure and a release. Take care. Goodbye. Then I turned off the phone. In the weeks that followed, I poured what I saved from the Mustang's potential sale into a small emergency fund, a repaired front door that had been sagging for months, and a mental health fund for myself. Therapy sessions I had postponed for years because I didn't have time, not because I didn't need them. I reconnected with my father, who came by the shop and without any sermon, clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You did right by yourself, son." That was all the approval I needed. Slowly, like the engine warm after a long winter, my life found its rhythm again. I worked on the Mustang when I felt nostalgic. I went on a weekend hike with a friend who had always been steady, and I learned to enjoy my own company without using distraction as an anesthetic. I even wore the clean necklace once, not to attract or to flaunt, but as a quiet reminder that small things chosen with thought mattered more than loud things chosen for show. People asked if I would ever go back, if I would give love another chance. I did not know then, and I still might not know, but I did know that I would not confuse silence for surrender or tolerance for love. The greatest revenge, it turned out, was not in watching her fall. It was in watching myself stand back up, steady, honest, and aware that when someone mocks the small symbols of your effort, you don't have to shatter to prove them right. You can simply rebuild, and in the rebuilding find a life that fits a little better, with pockets that hold your dignity and hands that can make something real.